In the dead of night, amidst a torrential downpour, a former Navy SEAL heard scratching at his door. Opening it, he found a soaking wet, trembling German shepherd. It didn't beg for food or shelter, but turned and dashed into the darkness, as if its life were slipping away with each passing moment. Following it, the soldier found a broken-down car by the roadside, where an elderly woman clutched her chest in pain, clinging to a weak puppy in her coat for the last vestiges of warmth. That night, he not only rescued the old woman, the mother dog, and the puppy, but also uncovered a heartbreaking secret about quiet kindness, hidden cruelty, and a mother dog willing to sacrifice everything to save the person who helped her. But most strangely, the dog seemed to know exactly where the right people and shelter were, as if God had silently led it to the only door still open in the midst of the storm. From a night filled with mud, tears, and fear, a soldier who seemed to have lost his heart found a reason to live, and abandoned creatures finally found a home. Where were you watching from, and what impressed you most after hearing this story? Leave a comment, and remember to like and subscribe to the channel to help us reach 1,000 subscribers soon. That would be a huge motivation for me to write even more great stories. Rain came down over the northern edge of Maine with a kind of old fury, as if the sky had found a grievance with the earth and meant to settle it before dawn. It slashed sideways through the black pines, rattled the loose metal chimney cap, and hurled itself against the wooden cabin perched on the low rise above the logging road. The place had been built to endure weather, not to welcome company. Its boards were thick, its windows narrow, its porch plain and practical. It suited the man who lived there. Silas Boone had been awake for hours. At 32, he still carried the unmistakable outline of the life he had once lived. He stood around 6 feet tall, built lean and solid rather than bulky, with the compact strength of a man who had spent years teaching his body to obey before fear could speak. His face was clean-shaven, the skin pale but roughened by northern wind and long winters, his square jaw and high cheekbones made sharper in the weak kitchen light. His dark brown hair was cut short in a military style, though just a little longer than regulation, as if discipline still lived in him, but no longer had the energy to argue over details. His eyes, gray-blue, cold at first glance and tired on the second, were the kind that missed very little and forgave even less. He wore what he wore almost every day, an old olive-gray tactical combat shirt, softened by years of use, the fabric faded at the shoulders and frayed at the cuffs. Worn earth-brown combat pants with scuffed knees and sagging cargo pockets, old military work boots, an old field watch on his wrist. Even alone in the middle of the night, he looked like a man half ready to move. He stood near the small iron stove, mug untouched in his hand, listening to the rain strike the roof. Storms did this to him, not because he feared them. Men like Silas were not shaped by fear in the usual sense, but certain sounds had the power to reach into locked rooms in the mind and turn on the light without permission. Heavy rain was one of them. It brought back memory, not in clean pictures, but in fragments. Water on concrete, someone shouting his name through static, red emergency lights trembling in a puddle, the sickening knowledge of having arrived only moments too late. He had built his life carefully since then. Small cabin, sparse routines, contract work when he needed it, limited conversation, no dog, no family, no one waiting on the other side of a bad night. The cabin lights flickered once, then again. Silas glanced up at the bulb over the sink. "Stay on," he muttered. The house answered with silence. Then came the sound. Scratch, scratch, scratch. Pause. Silas froze. It came again. Not a branch, not debris, not the random drag of weather. It had rhythm, sharp, urgent, deliberate. Scratch, scratch, scratch. Pause. The porch boards gave a soft creak under shifting weight. Every muscle in Silas tightened at once, not in panic, but in recognition. Whatever was outside, it wanted in, or wanted him out. He set down the mug without noise and moved toward the wall by the door where a flashlight hung from a nail. His posture changed as he crossed the room, the softness gone from it. He became economical, quiet, exact. Training did not vanish because a man wished it would. It only waited for need. Another scratch, this one shorter, weaker. Silas unlocked the door and opened it against the wind. The rain rushed in cold and immediate, bringing with it the smell of mud, pine bark, and runoff from the hill. For one strange heartbeat, he saw nothing but darkness and white rain flashing in the porch light. Then the dog stepped into view. She was a German shepherd, full-grown, female, perhaps 5 years old. Her black and tan coat was plastered flat by rain, making her look leaner than she really was. Mud darkened her legs and belly. One ear stood fully erect while the other tilted slightly back, not from weakness exactly, but from tension so constant it had learned to live in her body. Her face was beautiful, in the severe way working dogs often are. Long muzzle, strong brow, amber-brown eyes that looked almost gold in the porch light. There was nothing soft in her expression except desperation, and even that seemed held under strict control. She was shivering hard enough for him to see it. She was also watching him with the rigid concentration of an animal that had learned people could become dangerous without warning. She did not step onto the porch. She did not lower her head in submission, did not wag, did not beg. Instead, she backed down one step into the rain, turned sharply toward the dark road below the hill, then looked back at him. Silas said nothing. The dog repeated it. Look toward the road. Look back at him. Not food, he murmured. She made a low sound, not a growl, not a whine exactly, but something frayed and urgent, as if fear had been pulled so tight inside her it no longer knew what shape to take. Silas had seen strays before. He had seen abandoned dogs, injured dogs, feral dogs. This was none of those simple things. There was too much intent in her, too much decision. He should have shut the door. That was the sane choice. The storm was bad enough to swallow a truck tire in mud and hide a ditch under black water. The nearest town was far, the nearest useful help farther still. If there was a wreck down the road, somebody else could find it at daylight. If there was trouble waiting in the woods, then following a desperate animal into it in the middle of the night was exactly the sort of reckless impulse he had spent years punishing out of himself. He started to push the door closed. The dog lunged forward, not at him, but near him, and placed her wet nose against the inside of his wrist for one brief second. The touch was startlingly gentle. Then she turned away again. As the porch light caught her front leg, Silas saw a thin red ribbon mixed with mud above the paw. Not a deep wound, a scrape, maybe. Fresh enough to matter. And from somewhere down the road, far enough away to be uncertain, and near enough to be real, He thought he heard the weakest horn blast in the world. A single broken note. Then nothing. Silas went still. A strange thought passed through him then, quick as lightning, and twice as unwelcome. This was not a dog asking to be saved. This was a messenger. For one suspended moment, with rain needling his face, and the dog standing in the yard like a shadow that had chosen flesh, Silas felt the old resistance rise in him, the hard, bitter voice that said not again, not another life in his hands, not another night that could split him open. But the animal did something that made the breath catch in his throat. She took 2 steps into the storm, then stopped and looked not at the road, but at him, with a terrible, steady trust she had no business offering a stranger. It was the kind of look people spent years earning from one another, and often failed to keep. Silas hated how quickly that look reached him. Hated, more than that some buried part of him had already decided to follow. He stepped back into the cabin, grabbed the yellow rain shell from the peg, shoved his arms into it, and snatched the flashlight. He hesitated only long enough to pull the door nearly shut behind him. "All right," he said into the weather, sounding angrier than he meant to. "Show me." The dog was already moving. She did not run wild. She ran with direction, down the slick path from the cabin, across the wash of gravel, and toward the lower bend in the road where runoff always collected in bad weather. Silas followed, boots slipping once on the mud before he caught himself. The flashlight beam bounced and cut across sheets of rain, illuminating wet ferns, the bleached ribs of old branches, the glint of standing water in ruts. The dog kept glancing back to make sure he was there. That disturbed him almost more than anything else. It meant she was not merely fleeing something. She was guiding him. The logging road curved downward between banks of black pines. Water rushed in narrow streams along the edges, carrying pine needles, loose bark, and bits of gravel downhill. The wind came in uneven shoves. Somewhere above them a branch cracked and fell unseen into the dark. Silas kept one hand low for balance and the flashlight high. His mind worked against his will, building scenarios. A crashed vehicle. A hunter pinned under a tree. Someone drunk and freezing. A trap. A mistake. None of them explained the dog, or why her urgency felt less like panic than command. "Easy," he called once when she surged ahead. She did not slow, but her ears twitched, catching the tone. Another thing he did not like. The lower bend came into view only when the flashlight struck metal. A sedan sat crooked in the ditch-side mud, the front end angled down toward the shoulder, as though the storm itself had pressed a hand over the hood and shoved. One headlight was out. The other glowed dim and sickly through rain, not bright enough to help, only enough to make the whole scene look haunted. Water streamed off the windshield in shining sheets. The dog reached the car and stopped beside the driver's door, barking once, short, hoarse, and unlike any sound she had made before. Then she looked at Silas, chest heaving. He moved closer, pulse beginning at last to beat harder. The beam of the flashlight passed over the dented hood, the side mirror hanging half-broken, the wipers frozen mid-swipe. It climbed the driver's side window. And there, against the fogged, rain-streaked glass, a hand rose weakly from inside, old, pale, trembling. It tapped once, then slid down. Silas reached the car in 3 strides. Through the wet blur of the windshield, he made out the shape of an elderly woman slumped behind the wheel, her head bowed, one shoulder pressed awkwardly against the seat. Even through the glass he could see age in the narrow frame, the silver hair pulled loose from its pins, the fine-boned hand that had just fallen away from the window. She wore a heavy coat, clutched closed with desperate force over her chest. Then the coat moved, not from the woman's breathing, from something tucked inside it, something small, something alive. Silas's hand went to the door handle, and the dog beside him let out a sound so raw it seemed to come from a place deeper than fear. Silas yanked once at the driver's door and got nothing except a violent shudder through the frame. The car had sunk crooked into the muddy shoulder, front tire buried deep enough that the body leaned at an angle. Rain hammered the roof in hard metallic bursts. Water streamed along the edge of the ditch, black in the flashlight beam, fast enough to carry off loose gravel and pine needles. He wiped the handle with his sleeve, braced one boot against the rocker panel, and pulled again. Locked. Inside, the old woman's head tipped weakly against the seat. Up close, Silas could see more of her through the blurred glass. She was small and narrow-boned, perhaps in her 70s, wearing a soaked wool coat the color of wet ash. Wisps of silver-white hair had slipped loose from a careful twist at the back of her head and now clung to her temples. Her face was pale in the dashboard glow, deeply lined but fine-featured, the kind of face that might have once been delicate before grief and winters and long solitude carved themselves into it. Her mouth had gone bluish at the edges. One hand was clamped tight against her chest. The other, the one that had tapped against the window, trembled in slow, failing motions. And under the heavy coat she held closed with both forearms, there was movement. Small, fragile, alive. Silas lifted the flashlight, scanned once, and spotted the emergency tool clipped in the back of his truck belt kit, a glass punch no bigger than 2 fingers. He had carried things like that for years out of habit. Useful tools outlived the reasons men first bought them. Back, he told the dog. The German shepherd did not obey right away. She pressed herself near the driver's side, chest heaving, amber brown eyes fixed on the old woman. Rain flattened her black and tan coat so close to her body that the shadows of her ribs showed through. Mud clung to her legs. Her front paw bled from a torn nail or deep scrape, but she held herself with the stubborn rigidity of an animal that had spent too long surviving to let pain outrank purpose. Back, Silas repeated, sharper. This time she moved 2 steps away, though every line in her body remained aimed at the car. He struck the corner of the window. The glass cracked, starred, and gave. He knocked the worst of it clear with his forearm and reached inside, ignoring the bite of rainwater and broken edges, and unlocked the door from within. Cold air rushed out when he pulled it open. The woman drew a shallow breath that sounded more like a thread fraying than a lung working. "Ma'am," Silas bent close enough to be heard over the storm. "Can you hear me?" Her eyelids fluttered. Up close, her eyes were a washed blue-gray, still alert beneath the fog of pain. She tried to answer, but the words stuck. Her fingers tightened weakly over the coat in her lap. Silas followed the gesture and carefully peeled the fabric back. A German shepherd puppy, no more than 3 or 4 weeks old, lay tucked against the woman's sweater, like something smuggled out of winter itself. The little body was damp, but still warm in spots where her own heat had reached it. Its black and tan fur was soft and thin, the dark saddle only beginning to define itself. one ear folded flat. The eyes were half open, cloudy with exhaustion. It did not cry. That worried him more than crying would have. The old woman found enough breath to whisper, "Don't. Let her get cold." The puppy shifted once, weakly. Silas looked back at the woman. "What's your name?" Her lips parted. "Edith." "Edith, I'm getting you out." At the mention of movement, the mother dog gave a low, strained whine and circled once through the rain, then returned to the same position by the open door. She was not begging to be let in. She was watching sequence, measuring whether Silas understood what mattered first. He did. He checked Edith's airway, then 2 fingers to the side of her neck. Pulse, fast, uneven but present. Her breathing was shallow and quick. Pain in the chest, blue lips, shock and cold fighting for first place. He swept the interior with the flashlight beam and spotted an amber pill bottle on the wet floor mat, its cap gone, several tablets dissolved against pooled rainwater, tracked in from her shoes. Heart medication. So that was part of it. "Did you take one?" he asked. A faint shake of her head. "Were you trying to get to a hospital?" Edith swallowed with effort. "Clinic. In town." Another breath. The pup stopped nursing. The answer struck him harder than it should have. A woman this age, in a storm like this, driving an old sedan down a half-flooded road not because of herself, but because a puppy in her arms had gone cold. Silas stripped off his rain shell, wrapped it around the puppy, and tucked the small body inside against his chest for one moment while he reached for Edith's seatbelt. The pup weighed almost nothing. It felt wrong for anything alive to weigh so little. He helped Edith take one of the salvageable pills from a backup strip in the side pocket of her purse, then got an arm around her shoulders. She tried to resist, not from fear of him, but because her gaze kept drifting toward the dog outside. "The mother's here," Silas said. "I'm not leaving her." Something in Edith's face softened, just for a second. That was when his phone buzzed once, searching and failing. 1 bar, then none. He tried an emergency call anyway, got half a ring, then static and silence. The storm had flattened the signal across the basin. No quick rescue. No useful waiting. He had the old, bitter sensation again of being the nearest thing to help, whether he wanted that job or not. He got Edith out carefully, feeling how little of her weight she could carry. She was light in the alarming way frail people often were, as though time had been taking small, polite bites out of her for years. She smelled of rain, wet wool, peppermint, and the sharp, medicinal scent of heart tablets. The dog mother moved closer, but still did not jump. Silas glanced at her. "Stay where I can see you." The shepherd held his gaze, then lowered her head slightly, as if not obeying him exactly, but accepting the condition. He took Edith to his truck first, eased her into the passenger seat, reclined it just enough to keep her airway open, but not so far that her breathing worsened. Then tucked a thermal blanket from behind the seat around her shoulders. The puppy he laid inside a dry towel from his emergency kit, then wrapped it again and placed it gently against Edith's ribs beneath the blanket, where body heat might do the fastest work. Edith's hand came shakily over the bundle at once. "Breathe slow," Silas told her. She gave a tiny, humorless smile. "If it were that easy, I'd have learned by now." Even on the edge of collapse, she sounded like someone who did not waste words. He almost answered. Instead, he shut the truck door and turned back. The dog was standing where he had left her, rain streaming from her muzzle, tail low, eyes fixed on him. Up close, he could see she was older than he first thought, but still in her prime, 5 maybe. Powerful frame under the exhaustion. Scars, too. Faint ones around the throat and along one shoulder. Not fresh, not accidental either. The sort of marks a careful person would notice, and a cruel one would ignore. "Come on," he said. She did not. She looked at the truck, then at him, then toward the road behind them, as if counting distances he could not see. When Silas stepped closer, meaning to guide her by the scruff if he had to, the shepherd surprised him. She moved not away from him, but straight to the passenger side door where Edith sat inside. There, she rose on her hind legs, planted both muddy forepaws against the metal, and rested her forehead for one single second against the rain-streaked glass beside the old woman's shoulder. It was not panic, it was not wildness, it was recognition, deep, aching, human in the way loyalty sometimes is. Edith, half-conscious under the blanket, turned weakly toward the sound, and lifted trembling fingers toward the other side of the window. Their touch did not meet, only the glass did. Yet something in that silent exchange landed in Silas with the force of revelation. This dog had not come in the storm for herself. She had come for her person. Not an owner, perhaps. Not in any legal way, but hers all the same. Silas opened the rear door of the truck. The dog hesitated, nose working, ears twitching. "You've got one chance," he said quietly. "You bolt, you're on your own." He did not know why he phrased it that way. Maybe because it sounded harsher than saying what he really meant. "I don't know how to do this anymore." The shepherd gathered herself and leaped in. She did not climb onto the seat. She settled on the floor behind Edith instead, still trembling, watching the older woman with sleepless intensity. Every few seconds, her gaze cut to the wrapped puppy, then back to Edith, as if she were counting both heartbeats. Silas shut the door and got behind the wheel. The drive uphill to the cabin should have taken 4 minutes in good weather. That night, it felt like a negotiation with every bad decision a man could make in the dark. The truck fishtailed twice. Mud sucked at the tires. Water coursed across the ruts in silver ribbons. He drove one-handed at times, the other reaching toward Edith's neck or shoulder to reassure himself she had not slipped further under. "What were you doing out there?" he asked once, mostly to keep her conscious. Edith's eyes stayed half-closed. "She came to the porch." "Whose porch?" A pause. "Mine." The answer made no sense yet. He let it hang. "And the puppy?" She was cold. Edith's breath caught. "Wouldn't feed. Thought if I could get her to June." "June who?" "Mercer, the clinic." So there was a real destination. Good. It made her reckless choice less reckless and more desperate. Behind him, the mother dog made a sound deep in her chest. Not aggressive, just worn thin with fear. Silas glanced in the mirror and found her staring at him, eyes bright in the dim cabin light. There was intelligence in that stare he did not want to account for. Animals were simpler when they behaved like animals. This one was not simplifying anything. "You picked the wrong night," he muttered. The dog blinked rain from her lashes and kept watching. By the time the cabin came into view through the trees, Edith was shaking from cold even under the blanket. Silas parked hard, came around and got her out first. The porch boards boomed under his boots as he half carried her inside. Heat from the stove had faded, but not died. He laid her carefully on the narrow couch, threw more wood into the firebox, and worked with the swift, controlled efficiency he hated because it fit him too well. Dry blankets, boots off, wet coat open, pillow behind her shoulders, puppy wrapped and rewarmed against warmed towels near the stove, but not too near, water heating in the kettle, phone in the window searching for a signal. The shepherd entered last. She paused just inside the door, a dark, wet shape against the wood floor, every instinct in her divided between distrust and exhaustion. Then she crossed directly to the couch and sank beside it, not touching Edith, but near enough to intervene if the world did anything wrong again. Silas crouched by Edith to check her pulse once more. As he carefully slipped the wet wool coat from her shoulders, something fell from the inside pocket and hit the floor with a soft, papery scatter. Not one thing, several. Small plastic sandwich bags, each tied neatly with a rubber band, each holding a measured portion of dry dog food. Silas stared at them. There were too many for this to be chance, too many for one emergency trip. He looked at the old woman, then at the shepherd lying watchfully beside the couch, a woman with heart trouble, driving into a storm for a failing puppy, carrying pre-portioned food as if she had packed for a habit. Whatever this was, it had begun long before tonight. Morning did not arrive all at once. It seeped slowly into the Maine woods, a thin gray light filtering through wet pine boughs and low clouds that still clung to the hills, as if the storm had left pieces of itself behind. The rain had weakened to a fine mist, but the world around Silas Boone's cabin still looked waterlogged and exhausted. Every board of the porch held a darker shade of brown. Every rut in the road below brimmed with muddy water. The forest smelled of soaked bark, wet earth, and that strange metallic freshness that comes after a night when the sky has nearly broken itself open. Inside the cabin, the air was warmer but not settled. Heat from the stove had pushed back the cold, yet the room still carried the restless feeling of emergency. Blankets strewn over the couch, a kettle cooling near the sink, damp towels hanging over chairbacks, the old wooden floor marked with paw prints and boot tracks that had dried into dark smudges. Silas stood near the narrow kitchen counter, one hand wrapped around a fresh mug of coffee he had not touched. He had changed into a dry shirt, but kept the same old combat pants and boots, as if his body had not fully believed the worst of the night was over. His shoulders ached from hauling Edith out of the car. His right wrist stung where broken glass had nicked it. None of that bothered him as much as the quieter thing, the fact that he kept checking the couch, then the floor beside it, then the small laundry basket lined with blankets where the puppy lay. He had slept perhaps 20 minutes in a chair, and hated himself for every one of them. Edith Vale was awake now, though only barely. In daylight she looked older than she had in the car, not because age had advanced overnight, but because survival often strips away illusion. She was a small woman, finely built, and a little frail, with silver-white hair brushed back from a pale face full of soft lines and old endurance. Her eyes, when open, were a faded blue-gray, not weak at all, only tired in the way of people who had been carrying things silently for far too long. She lay under 2 blankets on Silas's couch, one thin hand above the covers, veins pale and blue beneath the skin. Even resting, she looked like someone more accustomed to apologizing for taking up space than asking to be cared for. At her feet, Bramble lay curled on the floorboards. The German shepherd's coat had dried in uneven waves, black saddle dark against the richer tan of her legs and chest. She was larger than she had first appeared in the storm, though still leaner than a healthy dog ought to be. The muscles in her shoulders were defined not by comfort, but by use. Fine scars showed more clearly in daylight, faint lines around the base of her neck, roughened patches near one shoulder. Her amber-brown eyes were closed, but only halfway. Even resting, she watched. In the basket near the stove, the puppy gave a weak twitch. Silas looked over at once. So did Bramble. The dog's head lifted before any sound came. That, more than anything else, unsettled him. She did not react like a wandering animal who had learned only hunger and fear. She reacted like something tuned to thresholds, breath changes, shifts in movement, the small decisions that happen before visible action. A truck engine ground up the road outside. Bramble rose in a flash, no growl at first, just a stiffening from nose to tail, so complete it seemed to erase the dog-shaped softness of her body and replace it with pure alertness. She moved 3 silent steps toward the door and stopped there, ears high, weight balanced forward. Silas set down his mug. "You're hearing them before I do now?" he muttered. The truck door slammed outside, then boots on the porch. A knock came, quick and practical. Silas opened the door to find 2 people under the clearing mist. The first was a woman in her late 30s, with the direct, composed look of someone used to stepping into messy situations and improving them without fanfare. Dr. June Mercer was not tall, perhaps 5'7", but she carried herself with clean efficiency. Her dark brown hair was tied low at the back of her neck, damp at the edges from the mist, and her face was sharp in an intelligent way rather than a hard one. Clear skin, pale from northern winters, steady hazel eyes, no wasted gestures. She wore a navy, weatherproof parka over dark layers, practical pants, and boots built for mud, not style. A black veterinary field bag hung at her hip, already unzipped as if she had been preparing on the drive up. There was nothing flustered about her. She looked like a person who had seen animals born, suffer, survive, and die, and had learned not to let urgency make her sloppy. Beside her stood a younger man, broad-shouldered and eager-faced despite the hour. Ezra Quinn looked about 27, with wind-reddened skin, short, light brown hair, and the rangy build of somebody who chopped his own firewood and still volunteered on rescue crews. His orange weather shell had reflective strips at the sleeves, and mud spattered his cargo pants to the knee. He had the open, decent expression of a man who still believed usefulness was a kind of moral duty. Silas recognized him from the county rescue unit, young enough to still admire former legends, old enough to have started seeing their cracks. "Morning," Ezra said softly, glancing past Silas. "Heard you had trouble." "Depends how you define it," Silas replied. June stepped in without wasting time. Her gaze moved once around the room, taking inventory the way experienced people do. Old woman on couch, dog by the door, puppy in basket, cuts on Silas's wrist, damp blankets, stove heat, medicine bottle on the table. Nothing in her face changed much, but some internal map of priorities clearly arranged itself. "Let me see the woman first," she said. Edith stirred at the sound of a new voice. June knelt beside the couch, introduced herself quietly, checked pulse, listened to her breathing, asked short questions in a low tone that did not invite panic. Then, she moved to the puppy. Wren, as the little one would later be called, looked smaller in morning light than she had at night. The black and tan pattern of a German shepherd was there, but only in a fragile beginning. One tiny paw flexed against the blanket. Her nose was cool, though not cold. Her breaths came shallow but regular. June warmed her fingers before touching her, then checked gums, belly, response. "She's hanging on," June said. "That's the good part." "And the bad part?" Silas asked. June glanced toward Bramble. "The mother was running on adrenaline last night. Another hour in that weather, and I'd be having a very different conversation with you." At that, Edith's eyes opened wider. "Bramble?" she whispered. It was the first full word she had chosen to spend on herself. The dog turned at once and crossed back from the door to the couch, slow now, cautious, almost solemn. She did not jump up or crowd Edith. She lowered her head to the blanket and stood there while the older woman's trembling fingers found the fur between her ears. Watching that, Silas felt something in him shift. Not soften, exactly, but lose some of its certainty. There was history in that touch. Not ownership, not possession, something quieter and more human than that. June noticed it too. "She knows her." Edith's hand lingered on Bramble's head. "Not mine," she said softly, as if correcting a sacred misunderstanding. "Just hungry for a long time." No one spoke for a moment. Then June stood and said, "Tell me from the beginning." Edith seemed embarrassed by the request, which struck Silas as absurd after the night she'd survived. But she obeyed in fragments. Since early spring, she said, she had been leaving small portions of food near the far bend in the forest road, beyond the last mailbox, and just before the ground dipped toward the old logging path. At first, she only saw signs: disturbed gravel, empty paper trays, once a set of muddy paw prints leading into the trees. Then, one morning, from her parked car, she saw the dog at a distance, thin, wet, watching from the brush. "I never tried to call her over," Edith said, each sentence requiring care. "She wouldn't have come. I just left the food and sat a while, talked sometimes. Foolish, maybe." "It wasn't foolish," Ezra said quietly. Edith gave the faintest smile. "You're young enough to still say that kindly." June crouched near Bramble then, not reaching immediately, only watching. The dog's eyes fixed on her hand, her shoulders, the line of her posture. June changed her angle slightly, turning sideways instead of looming forward. "Interesting," she murmured. "What?" Silas asked. "This dog doesn't just react," June said. "She evaluates sequence." Her gaze stayed on Bramble. "She watched me check Edith first, then the puppy. Only after that did she relax enough to settle. That isn't random temperament." As if understanding she had become the subject, Bramble shifted her eyes to Silas, not with fear this time, not even with distrust exactly. Something stranger, something measuring. In that silent look, Silas felt a jolt of recognition he did not want. He had seen soldiers do that before entering rooms they suspected were dangerous, track the order of bodies, hands, exits, intent. The dog was not just learning people. She had already learned too much about what people could do. Marlene Pike arrived not long after, carrying a casserole dish she had likely filled with something before dawn, because older women in small northern towns often treated crisis and food as twin obligations. She was in her early 70s, a rounder, sturdier sort of woman than Edith, with silver-gray hair cut short around a face weathered by cold air and community gossip. Her coat was a deep green, her scarf plum-colored, and her expression held equal parts concern and vindication, as if she had long suspected Edith was up to something, and finally had proof. "I told her not to go out alone when the weather turned," Marlene said after one look at the couch. "Did she listen? Of course not." Edith closed her eyes. "Good morning to you, too." Marlene's voice softened. "You scared me half to death." From her came further confirmation. Since March, she said, Edith had been carrying food down the road in little tied bags, rain or shine. Mud season, cold mornings, the first black flies of spring. When Marlene asked what for, Edith would only say, "There's a mother out there who doesn't trust anyone yet." Silas looked toward the small pile of food packets he had set on the table. So that was what they were. Not emergency rations. Ritual. June eventually cleaned Bramble's front paw while Edith watched like a nervous relative. The dog flinched but did not bite. She tolerated the bandaging with grim patience, though her eyes never left June's face. When Silas stepped closer to hand over a strip of cloth, Bramble glanced at him and did not growl. That disturbed him more than if she had. Trust, especially wounded trust, should come slower. By afternoon, the sky had brightened from iron to pewter. Ezra left to check road conditions and try to call the county line from higher ground. Marlene stayed long enough to make tea, fuss over Edith, and leave half the casserole before heading home. June said she would return later if needed, but wanted the woman resting and the pup kept warm. Before leaving, she paused by Silas on the porch. "There's something off here," she said. "Meaning?" June zipped her bag closed. "That dog has scars in places I don't like, and instincts I don't expect from an animal born and raised wild. I'm not saying I know what happened to her." She looked toward the cabin window where Bramble's silhouette stood watching from inside. "I'm saying somebody taught her lessons she had no business needing." Silas watched her truck disappear through the trees. By evening, the cabin grew quiet, in that deceptive way country places do, where silence is never truly empty, but made of small sounds layered together. The stove settling, wind slipping through wet branches, puppy breaths in a basket, Edith shifting under blankets, Bramble pacing once and then stopping. Silas should have felt relief. Instead, a slow unease kept needling him. He noticed it first in Bramble. She would lie down for a minute, then rise and go to the door, not scratching, not asking out, just standing there, ears lifted toward the forest, listening. Once, after full dark, she went to the back window and held herself utterly still for so long that Silas finally crossed the room to look out too. He saw only rain-dark trees and the pale shine of standing water. "What is it?" he asked her, feeling stupid as soon as the words left his mouth. Bramble did not look at him. Near midnight, Edith was sleeping more steadily. Wren had taken a little watered milk from a syringe under June's instructions. The fire burned low but warm. Silas finally dozed in the chair. At dawn, he woke to the wrong kind of quiet. Bramble was at the open front door, not outside, just there, rigid and waiting, the fur along her spine lifted slightly. Silas stood at once and stepped onto the porch. The air was cold and washed clean. Mist clung low among the pines. The storm had fully moved off at last, leaving the road soft and dark beneath the morning sky. At first he saw nothing unusual. Then, a few yards from the porch, Where the mud flattened before meeting the rutted track, he found the marks. Tire tracks, fresh enough that the edges had not yet softened. A vehicle had come up the road in the night, stopped near the cabin, then turned back the way it came. No knock, no call, no engine left idling long enough to wake him. Just approach, pause, leave. Silas crouched and pressed 2 fingers into the wet groove. Behind him, Bramble stood in the doorway, staring at the road as if she had been watching it long before morning had made it visible. He straightened slowly. Someone had come to the cabin in the dark, and the dog had known it before any of them. The day never truly brightened. By late morning, the storm had passed, but the sky above the Maine woods remained the color of cold tin, pressing low over the pines and the half-flooded logging road below Silas Boone's cabin. Water still dripped from the eaves in a slow, stubborn rhythm. The air smelled of wet bark, mud, and the faint smoke from Silas's stove. It was the kind of day that looked calm from a distance and troubled up close. Silas stood at the front window with his hands resting on the frame, staring at the tire marks in the mud until the shape of them lodged somewhere behind his eyes. Whoever had come in the night had not gotten stuck. Whoever had come had known how close to drive and how quickly to leave. Behind him, the cabin was awake in uneven ways. Edith Vale sat upright now on the couch, wrapped in one of Silas's old wool blankets. The color had begun to return to her face, but only slightly. She still looked breakable in certain angles of light. At 74, she had the delicate bones of someone who had once been graceful, and then spent a long life learning how to carry grief without making noise about it. Her silver hair, combed back more neatly now, revealed a high forehead and a face full of fine lines that deepened when she was tired or forced to speak about anything personal. Today, they were deep. Her hands, folded over the blanket in her lap, were small, veined, and steady only because she was making them stay that way. Bramble lay on the floor beside the couch, but only in the technical sense. The German shepherd was at rest without being relaxed. Her black and tan coat, brushed roughly dry by June the day before, had regained some fullness, though the thinness beneath it still showed in the angles of her hips and rib cage. One bandaged forepaw lay stretched out before her. Her amber-brown eyes tracked every movement in the room, especially anyone who moved toward Edith or the puppy. Wren, tucked into a lined wooden crate padded with towels near the stove, slept in short, uneven bursts, small sides lifting and falling like something the world had not yet fully decided to keep. A truck came up the road. Bramble's head snapped toward the window before the engine sound fully reached human ears. Silas turned. The truck was county-issued, mud-splattered dark green, with a light bar on top that remained mercifully off. It rolled to a stop near the porch, and a tall man climbed out with the controlled impatience of someone already annoyed before his boots hit the ground. Deputy Nolan Price had the kind of face that weather and duty sharpened instead of softened. He was in his early 40s, maybe 41 or 42, broad across the shoulders, with a grounded, workmanlike build that came less from a gym than from years of lifting the wrong things at the wrong hours. His dark brown hair was cut short beneath a black knit cap, and he wore a winter deputy's jacket over his uniform, the heavy fabric open just enough to show the badge clipped to his chest. His jaw was clean-shaven, strong, and usually set as though patience were a tool he used carefully to avoid wearing it out. He had known Edith all his life, and familiarity, in his case, had never reduced the force of his concern. If anything, it made it sharper. He knocked once, then stepped inside when Silas opened the door. "I get one call about a car in a ditch," Nolan said, taking in the room with one long glance. "And, by the time I get up here, I've got an elderly woman with heart trouble, a former SEAL playing field medic, and a German shepherd looking at me like I'm the reason taxes exist." Bramble did not blink. "That dog may have a point," Silas said. Nolan removed his cap and gave Edith a look that held more frustration than formality. "Miss Vale." "Nolan, you want to explain why you decided to take your car into a storm that had half the county sitting still?" Edith lifted her chin. "I already survived it. You don't get to make it sound dramatic after the fact." Something in Nolan's expression tightened, then settled. He cared too much to stay neutral, which meant he often sounded harsher than he meant to. "That's not an answer." "No," Edith said quietly. "It's the part of the answer I'm willing to start with." Silas almost looked away then. There was something rawer in the room than disagreement. It was the old chemistry of small-town history, of people who had watched one another age into burdens they resented being seen to carry. Another vehicle approached not long after, this one louder and slower. A tow rig. Harvey Lynn came in with the smell of cold air and garage oil wrapped around him like a second coat. He was nearing 70, thick through the chest and stomach, with a face weathered into permanent creases by decades of engines, winter roads, and practical disappointment. His gray hair was thin at the crown and flattened under a faded cap, advertising a brand of tires that had probably gone out of business 10 years ago. He wore a brown canvas work jacket over a red and black flannel shirt, and his hands were broad, scarred, and permanently stained at the knuckles no matter how often he washed them. "Pulled your car out," Harvey told Edith, not bothering with preamble. "Front end drank half the ditch, but the axle's still good. Water got into the electrical, and the battery was already one bad morning from giving up. Nobody cut a line or tampered with anything. That mattered." Silas saw Nolan register it too. No sabotage, no staged breakdown. Edith had truly tried to drive out in desperation. Harvey looked down at Bramble and let out a soft breath through his nose. "Pretty dog," he said. Bramble remained motionless. "Pretty suspicious dog," he amended. By noon, June Mercer returned. She came in carrying more supplies and less patience for nonsense than most people could manage before lunch. In daylight, her composure seemed even more pronounced. She had the face of a woman who had learned that panic only made other people feel useful. Her dark hair was tied back again, her sharp hazel eyes cool and focused, her navy field parka damp at the shoulders from mist. She set down her bag, washed her hands at Silas's sink without asking, then crouched beside Bramble. This time she examined the dog more carefully. Bramble tolerated it because Edith was near, because Wren was warm, and perhaps because June did not touch like a person trying to own anything. She parted fur around the throat, the shoulders, the flanks. Her expression changed only once, and even then it was slight. "What?" Nolan asked. June sat back on her heels. "These scars." Silas crossed the room. Up close, he could see them more clearly now. Pale, rough patches beneath the coat around the base of Bramble's neck, thin, healed lines along one shoulder, a heavier, textured area near the hip where fur had grown back unevenly. Not claw marks, not the tearing randomness of branches or barbed wire, June looked from the dog to the people in the room. This isn't forest damage. Not most of it. Edith's fingers tightened around the blanket. June continued, her voice even. Some of these marks are from pressure, repeated pressure, something tight at the neck, confinement at the shoulder and hip, not one accident, patterned wear. Silas said nothing, but inside him something went colder. Nolan folded his arms. You're saying someone kept her? I'm saying she didn't do this to herself by running through trees. At that, Bramble rose and moved to Edith's side, pressing one flank lightly against the couch as if taking position without being told. The room fell quiet. Then Edith sighed, the sound small and old and tired. I saw her first in March, she said. Everyone turned. She did not speak quickly, and because of that, no one interrupted. She told it in fragments, each piece handled like something fragile. One cold morning, near the end of winter, she had been driving back from town when she noticed movement near an abandoned parcel by the old timber road west of the basin. Not a proper house, not anymore. Just the remains of a place that had once stored equipment, and maybe livestock feed years ago before it fell into neglect. She had seen a dog there, thin beyond reason, coat dull, ribs showing, watching from beside a collapsed outbuilding. Not like a stray, Edith said, like a creature waiting to be punished for being seen. Silas felt the words settle in him. Edith had gone back the next day with food, then the next. She never approached too close, never called loudly. She would leave a small packet, sit in her car or on the roadside and talk into the empty air until Bramble decided whether to appear. "Why didn't you call it in?" Nolan asked, and though his tone was controlled, anger beat under it. Edith turned toward him slowly. "Because I also saw a truck." "What truck?" "Old, dark, no clear plate that I could make out. It went in and out of that property twice in 1 week." She swallowed. "I thought if I made noise too soon, whoever it belonged to would move her before anyone bothered to look. That's not how this works." "No," Edith said with sudden, painful calm. "That's how it works when you're old, alone, and afraid that being right too early will cost the only living thing you can still help." Bramble reacted before anyone answered. A distant engine sounded on the road. Nothing unusual, just a passing vehicle farther down the hill. But the dog's whole body changed. Her ears flattened. The fur along her spine rose. She moved not toward the door this time, but between Edith and the room, angled slightly as if to shield her from something no one else had named yet. Then Edith lowered one trembling hand and touched the side of Bramble's neck, where the roughest scar lay. The transformation was immediate. The dog did not stop watching the room, but the panic left her muscles as quickly as it had come. Silas stared at that touch, at the exact place Edith had gone without looking, not because she guessed, because she knew. And in that instant, it became impossible to keep pretending this was merely a story of a hungry dog and a kind old woman. There was history here, bruised and wordless, and the dog's body remembered every part of it. Nolan exhaled through his nose. "You should have told somebody." Edith met his stare without flinching. "I am telling somebody now." "That's months late." "Yes," she said, "and still sooner than if she had died out there." That shut him up for a beat. Silas stood near the stove, silent, caught between the clean shape of the law and the messier truth of what fear does to decent people. Part of him sided with Nolan, Secrets got people hurt. Delays made bad situations worse. But another part of him, the part that had seen chaos crush proper systems before they could even begin, understood Edith too well. Weakness did not always look like surrender. Sometimes it looked like an old woman portioning dog food into tiny bags for weeks because it was the only form of protection she could afford to offer. Harvey scratched the side of his face. That old parcel out by the timber road has had odd traffic before. Nothing enough to pin a complaint on. People dumping scrap, kids trespassing, hunting parties cutting through where they shouldn't. Hard to tell what matters unless you're standing in the middle of it. June rose and rewrapped Bramble's bandaged paw, gentler this time. Then maybe we need to stand in the middle of it. Nolan shot her a look. Or maybe we proceed without turning this cabin into a meeting hall for bad decisions. Then proceed, June replied. But do it fast. The rest of the afternoon passed in a strained sort of order. Harvey went back to his garage with promises to keep Edith's car under cover until she could decide what to do with it. Nolan radioed in only the necessary facts, leaving out more than he usually would. June checked Edith again and insisted on strict rest. Wren fed a little more from the syringe, enough to quiet one layer of fear. Silas moved through it all with the ugly ease of a man who knew how to stabilize a room in crisis, but hated being noticed for it. He split wood, refilled water, checked locks, and cleaned the shallow cut on his wrist properly at last. Each task gave his hands some place to go while his mind kept returning to the same things: tire tracks, scars, an abandoned property, an old woman feeding a dog in secret, and the unmistakable fact that someone else might already know where Bramble was. By dusk, the visitors were gone. The sky darkened early. Mist thickened among the trees. The cabin lights threw warm rectangles across the wet yard. Inside, Edith slept again. Wren lay bundled and quiet. Bramble refused the blanket June had left for her, and chose instead a place near the back door where she could watch both the room and the window. Every so often she stood, paced once, and listened. Silas checked the front latch, then the back one. Something about the air had changed. Not danger exactly. Anticipation. He had just finished banking the stove for the night when Bramble rose without sound and moved toward the rear of the cabin. Not hurried, deliberate. Silas followed. The back room was little more than a mud entry, with a side door leading to the narrow shed area he used for tools, extra feed, and in better weather, temporary shelter crates for injured wildlife before transport. Tonight, the place was dark except for the spill of kitchen light behind him. The door stood closed. The latch hung crooked. Silas went still. He opened it slowly. Cold air slid in at once. The temporary crate space beyond had been disturbed, not ransacked, not destroyed. One hasp had been pried loose from the small kennel enclosure June had suggested using later, if Bramble needed separation while Wren gained strength. The chain lay slack on the ground. Nothing was missing because nothing had been inside. And at the threshold, placed with almost ceremonial neatness on the wet wooden planks, lay a strip of old leather. Silas bent and lifted it. It was part of a restraint collar, a slip-style piece rotted with age, the buckle greened with corrosion. The leather was cracked, but still held the memory of force in its curve. No note, no footprint clear enough to read in the dark. Just that. Behind him, Bramble did not bark. She stared at the collar in his hand and let out a sound so low and quiet It barely qualified as sound at all. Silas looked from the ruined leather to the shadowed yard beyond the open shed. No one had taken anything. No one had touched Edith. No one had tried the doors. But the message was plain. Whoever was out there did not need to ask if the dog was here. They already knew. Silas Boone did not sleep much after finding the old leather slip collar on the planks behind the cabin. He sat through most of the night in the kitchen chair nearest the back door, one hand resting on the table, the other curled around a mug of coffee that had long since gone cold. The cabin stayed quiet in the uneasy way quiet places often do, after a threat has passed close enough to leave a shape behind. Edith slept in brief, fragile stretches. Wren stirred once or twice in the lined crate by the stove, and was soothed by the warmth and the low rasp of Bramble's breathing from the floor beside her. The German shepherd did not truly lie down all night. She folded herself to the boards, then rose at intervals to listen, her head angled toward the back wall or the road, as though the dark itself had developed a language, and she no longer trusted any of it. At dawn, the sky came up flat and pale over the Maine woods. Mist clung low among the pines. Water still dripped from the eaves, but the air had changed. The violence had gone out of it. What remained was exposure. The raw look of land after weather had stripped it down. Silas stood at the sink, washing the same cup twice without realizing it, when Nolan Price's truck came back up the road. The deputy stepped onto the porch, already wearing the expression of a man who had argued with himself on the drive over and not enjoyed losing. Nolan's winter uniform jacket was zipped high against the morning chill, his knit cap pulled low, his jaw set harder than usual. He looked as though the county had handed him one more rural mess that refused to fit neatly into the forms. "I made a few calls," he said once Silas let him in. "Not enough to stir the whole department, but enough to cover myself if this turns into something ugly." Silas leaned back against the counter. And I'm not putting out a county alert based on an old woman's memory, a dog with scars, and a piece of rotted leather." Nolan's eyes shifted briefly toward Edith on the couch, then softened despite himself. "But I will go look at that abandoned parcel if I'm there in person, and if nobody does anything stupid." "Define stupid," Silas said. "Anything that gets me paperwork, and you a body bag." Ezra Quinn arrived 20 minutes later in his rescue shell, mud already drying on his boots from whatever errand he had done before sunrise. He had the same earnest face as ever, young but not boyish, his expression open in a way that made older men either trust him instantly or try to toughen him for the world. He looked from Nolan to Silas and understood enough to keep his questions brief. "We going?" he asked. Before either man could answer, Edith stirred. She had more color today, though it was the thin kind that never quite defeated the fatigue under it. Her silver hair had been pinned back again, and she wore one of Silas's clean flannel shirts over a warm undershirt June had brought. The sleeves were far too long, but she had folded them with careful hands. She did not look strong. She looked composed, which, in some people, is a greater act of will. From beneath the blanket in her lap, she pulled out a small rectangular tin box. It had once held candies, perhaps decades ago. The painted lid was scratched nearly colorless at the corners, and a faded cluster of blue flowers remained visible beneath the rust. Edith held it with both hands for a moment before offering it to Silas. "If you go there," she said quietly, "take this." Silas took the tin. It was lighter than he expected. "What is it?" "Something I kept because I couldn't decide whether saving it meant remembering or refusing to let go. Edith's eyes lifted to his. Don't open it unless you need to understand why I couldn't leave her out there. Nolan frowned. Miss Vale. She turned toward him with tired patience. You want the neat version, Nolan. I know, but neat is not always true. He said nothing to that. Bramble rose as the men began to gather coats and gear. The dog's bandaged paw still made her weight fall a fraction unevenly, but she moved with determination rather than weakness. She stood near the door and watched Silas pull on his old olive-gray combat shirt under his weather shell, strap on a flashlight, tuck gloves into his pocket, and slide the tin box into the inside breast of his jacket. No, June Mercer said from the doorway. Everyone turned. She had arrived quietly, as competent people often do. Her dark hair was braided today, her navy parka damp at the shoulders, her medical bag in one hand. Her hazel eyes went from Bramble to Silas to Nolan. If you're taking that dog to a place that may have hurt her, you're not doing it without me checking her first. June knelt and ran practiced hands over Bramble's shoulders, neck, and back legs. The dog endured it, eyes on Silas the entire time. She can walk, June said at last. Not all day, not hard. If she goes, somebody watches her, and the minute she shuts down, you bring her back. I'm not babysitting a dog, Nolan said. You're babysitting all of us, Ezra replied. Nolan sighed. I liked you better when you didn't talk so early in the morning. The drive out to the old timber road took less than 20 minutes and felt longer. The route narrowed after the county gravel gave way to broken dirt and half-forgotten service tracks. Trees pressed in close, their trunks black with moisture. Runoff from the storm still crossed the path in shallow ribbons, and the truck tires sank into mud in ways that made every turn feel provisional. Bramble rode in the back with Ezra, standing as long as she could, then sitting, then rising again whenever the truck slowed. She did not whine. She did not paw at the windows. She only watched, and the deeper they went, the quieter she became. That's the thing I don't like, Ezra murmured once, not realizing Silas could hear him from the front. What thing? Nolan asked, eyes still on the road. She isn't scared the way a stray would be. She's bracing. They found the place because the storm had done them a favor no human decency had managed. It had stripped the ground. The abandoned parcel sat beyond a stand of alder and young pine, half hidden from the road by terrain and neglect. Whatever building had once stood there had mostly collapsed inward years ago. A sagging roofline remained over one corner, and sections of warped plank wall still leaned against one another in damp silence. But it was the ground around it that told the real story. The rain had peeled back layers of mud and leaf litter. Beneath them lay things too deliberate to belong to weather. Metal stakes driven into the earth at measured intervals. Lengths of rusted chain. A dented water pan half buried in silt. Wire mesh pressed flat under a collapsed timber. Fragments of heavy tarp tangled in brush. Not a camp. Not an accidental dumping ground. Not one tidy answer either. Just enough structure to suggest confinement, repetition, and the kind of cruelty that prefers not to leave paperwork. No one spoke for several seconds. Nolan was first to crouch. He brushed mud from one of the stakes with a gloved hand and swore under his breath. Ezra moved farther toward the remains of the shed, his boots sinking softly. There are scrape marks here, he said. "Something metal stood against this wall a long time." Silas opened the truck and let Bramble out. She did not run. That struck him harder than if she had bolted. The German shepherd stepped slowly through the exposed ground, nose low but not frantic, ears shifting to every small sound. There was no panic in her, only a stillness that seemed heavier than fear. She moved past one bent pan, paused near a broken length of chain, then continued until she reached the far side of the ruined structure where the earth had been washed unevenly into a shallow slope. There, she stopped. Her whole body went motionless. Silas approached carefully. Bramble lifted one paw and set it down against the mud. Not digging, not scratching wildly, just pressing once, then again, as if memory itself had weight, and she was trying to show him where it had settled. For one strange moment, the morning seemed to go silent around them. No wind in the trees, no shifting gravel under Nolan's boots, no drip from the ruined eaves. Bramble lowered her head over that patch of ground and let out a sound so soft it could have been mistaken for breath. But Silas knew it wasn't. It was grief, thinned to a thread. He had heard men make noises like that in field hospitals, when the morphine had not arrived yet, and pride had finally gone useless. The dog did not paw harder, did not perform for them. She simply stood over that buried place, as if something there had once been important enough to break her, and small enough to be hidden. Silas felt the tin box in his jacket suddenly become heavy. He crouched and dug with his gloved hands. The mud was soft from the storm. It gave way in clumps, slick and cold. Beneath the top layer he found not bone and not metal cage wire, but a strip of leather. He tugged gently until it came free. A collar, old and stiff with age, the buckle greened and rough, the leather darkened by years underground. A narrow brass plate was fixed to it. Silas wiped it clean with the heel of his hand. A name had been stamped into the metal, not Bramble. He stared a second too long before slipping the collar into his jacket pocket. "Find something?" Nolan called. "Yeah," Silas said. "What kind of something?" "The kind we take back." They searched another half hour and found enough to turn suspicion into direction, but not enough to explain the whole shape of the place. June photographed the stakes and chains with her phone. Nolan marked the approximate boundaries. Ezra found old feed sacks cut into makeshift bedding and a section of pipe that might once have held a hose. It all added up without adding up cleanly. Someone had used this parcel to keep animals, more than one, and not kindly. But for how long, and for what purpose, remained blurred at the edges. On the drive back, Bramble lay down in the truck bed without being asked. The silence in her felt less like relief than retreat. Back at the cabin, Edith was sitting by the window with a blanket over her knees when Silas came in. The pale light made her face look both older and more open. She saw at once that something had changed. "You found it," she said. Silas removed the tin box from his jacket and set it on the table between them. "I think I found part of it." Nolan and June gave them space without leaving the room entirely. Ezra took Wren's feeding instructions from June and quietly disappeared into the kitchen corner. Even Nolan, for all his impatience, seemed to sense the moment belonged elsewhere. Silas opened the tin. Inside were old photographs, folded letters, a dried ribbon, and a veterinary badge on a cracked clip. The first photograph showed a younger Edith standing beside a teenage boy with a serious face and kind eyes. He was tall and narrow through the shoulders, with dark hair falling across his forehead, and the expression of someone more comfortable beside animals than people. At his knee sat a shepherd dog, black and tan, ears high, posture proud. Edith touched the edge of the photo with one finger. "My son," she said. "Micah." Her voice did not break. That somehow made the loss feel bigger. She told it slowly. Years ago, Micah Vale had worked around legal training yards and farm dogs, not in anything glamorous, just the practical world where working animals were raised, handled, and sometimes rehoused. He had taught Edith what fear looked like in a dog that did not dare show it outright. He had shown her the difference between neglect and discipline, between an animal merely untrained and one already carrying harm inside its body. After he died, illness, sudden and merciless, before 40, Edith had kept his notes, his letters, and the habit of noticing the creatures other people walked past. "When I saw her the first time," Edith said, meaning Bramble, "I knew she had that same look, not wildness, expectation of pain." Silas said nothing. There were a few letters in Micah's hand describing dogs he had worried over, systems he distrusted, places where animals were treated like equipment if no one asked too many questions. Nothing directly criminal. Nothing that would make a case. Just the weary conscience of a decent man who had seen enough to know kindness and use were often forced to live side by side. Edith looked up. "I didn't save her because I'm noble, Mr. Boone. I fed her because I know what it is to watch something precious weaken in front of you and have too little power to stop it." The words entered him cleanly and stayed there. He reached into his pocket and laid the recovered collar on the table. Edith saw the brass plate and went white. For a second, Silas thought she might stop breathing altogether. Her hand flew to her mouth. Tears filled her eyes so quickly, it looked less like crying than recognition returning at full speed after years underground. June crossed half the room in case Edith's heart gave out again, but Edith held up a trembling hand to stop her. She stared at the collar and whispered, "So it really survived." Silas's pulse kicked once, hard. Not she, not Bramble, it. Edith lifted her gaze to him, full of shock and sorrow, and something almost like awe, and all she said was, "Then it really did live." The second storm came faster than the first. By late afternoon, the sky over the Maine woods had turned the color of bruised steel, and the pines beyond Silas Boone's cabin stood in rows of uneasy silence, their upper branches already bending toward the wind before the rain had even fully arrived. The light drained out of the day too early. Shadows pooled beneath the porch steps. The lake beyond the trees, usually a distant sheet of cold silver, vanished into the thickening gray. Inside the cabin, everything felt too still for what was coming. Silas stood at the table with both hands flat against the wood, the old collar lying between him and Edith Vale like something unearthed not from mud but from time. The brass plate had been cleaned enough to read. The name on it had not changed since the moment he had first made it out beneath the dirt, but the weight of it seemed heavier now that Edith had spoken. Micah's old letters and photographs remained spread from the tin box, their edges curled and softened by years of being handled only in private. June Mercer stood near the stove, arms folded, watching Edith the way one watches a patient whose body is fragile, but whose next words may matter more than any medicine. Nolan Price remained near the front window, rigid with that particular brand of lawman frustration that comes from feeling events move faster than procedure. Ezra Quinn leaned against the kitchen counter, hands wrapped around a mug he had forgotten to drink from. Marlene Pike, having returned with another blanket and no intention of leaving until the trouble was over, sat close to Edith with her coat still on, her lined face pulled tight with worry. On the floor beside Edith's knees, Bramble lay stretched out with her head lifted. Wren slept in the padded crate near the stove, small and soft and alive enough to make everyone in the room unconsciously check on her every few minutes. Edith touched the collar once, then drew her hand back. "When Micah was still working around those training yards," she said, voice thin but steady, "there were stories. Not the sort people put in reports. The sort they tell in parking lots and on smoke breaks, because no one wants to accuse the wrong man, and no one wants to admit they looked away too long." Silas said nothing. He had learned long ago that silence, used correctly, could make room for truth. "There were litters moved from place to place," Edith continued. "Dogs that vanished between proper records, animals that were supposed to go to one handler or one farm, and instead ended up somewhere no one could quite track. Some sold, some bred, some broken down into whatever made money fastest." Her blue-gray eyes drifted to Bramble. "Micah once wrote about a line of shepherds with strange names, wildflower names: Briar, Clover, Bramble." Her mouth trembled once, then steadied. "He said they were good dogs, too good for the people circling around them." June's face hardened, but only in the eyes. "You think this collar belonged to one of those dogs?" she asked. Edith nodded faintly. "I don't know if Bramble is one of them. I only know when I first saw her I felt—" She closed her eyes. "No, not certainty. Recognition. As if something wounded had come back from a place that should have swallowed it." Outside, the first heavy drops struck the roof. 1, then 3, then a hard, rattling sheet. Nolan turned from the window. "If weather's turning again, we need to decide what happens next. I can get a deputy unit to keep an eye on the road, but I need cause if I'm asking for more." Silas looked toward the back of the cabin. "You already have cause." "Not enough for the county," Nolan said. "Enough for me to worry, not enough for a full search team." Marlene let out a soft, disgusted breath. "There's always enough for worry." Edith said quietly, "Sometimes worry is all old people get issued." The room almost softened around that, but not quite. Then Bramble stood up, not suddenly, not with a growl. She rose as if something invisible had lifted her from inside. Silas turned at once. The dog moved toward Wren's crate, nose low, then to the back door, then back again. Her ears were forward, her body tense in a strange listening way. "She hears something," Ezra said. June crossed to the puppy's crate and checked Wren quickly. "She's fine." Bramble gave a sharp, low sound in her throat. Silas moved toward the back room. The rain thickened so fast against the roof it sounded like gravel. Wind shoved once against the walls. Somewhere outside, a branch cracked. When Silas reached the mudroom, he saw at once what was wrong. The back door stood open by less than an inch. Cold air slipped through the seam. He swore and lunged forward. The latch had been worked from the outside and not properly caught when closed again. Mud marked the threshold. One print, then another, fresh enough to shine wet. Behind him, Bramble made a sound that was not a bark and not a howl, but something torn straight out of the center of her. Silas turned. The crate by the stove was empty. For a heartbeat, nobody moved. Then the cabin exploded into motion. Bramble hit the back door so hard it banged wide against the outer wall. Nolan shouted something behind Silas. Orders, questions, maybe both. But the words disappeared under the crash of rain. Edith half rose from the couch with a cry Marlene couldn't contain fast enough. June rushed to keep her from collapsing. Ezra was already fumbling for his radio. Silas looked once at the muddy prints, once at the open darkness beyond the door, and knew with awful clarity what had happened. Whoever had come was not here to kill. They had taken the smallest, weakest thing in the room because they understood exactly what would follow. "Stay with Edith," he snapped at June and Marlene. "Nolan, roadblock if you can." "I'm already moving," Nolan shot back, hand to the radio. "Ezra, call County and get a unit to the Timber Road crossing." Bramble was gone into the rain. Silas followed. The storm swallowed him in seconds. Rain lashed his face. Mud sucked at his boots. The forest around the cabin, which in daylight could look almost gentle, had become again what it truly was in weather like this, indifferent, slick, and full of ways to fall. He saw Bramble 30 yards ahead, a black and tan streak cutting through the gray. She was running hard despite the bandaged paw, nose lifting and dropping, body angling as if scent and memory were pulling together into one line. Silas did not call her back. There was no point. For the first time in years, he did not hesitate in the doorway of danger and negotiate with the past before moving. He moved because there was a life ahead of him that needed reaching, that was all. The old pain did try to rise, some reflex of memory, some ghost of another storm, another impossible minute. But it broke apart the moment Bramble slowed near the washed-out bend and looked back at him. Not pleading, not panicked, waiting, expecting him to understand. And for once, Silas did not mistake urgency for punishment. He did not hear failure in the rain. He did not feel the old accusation that he had come too late, too slow, too human. What he felt instead was strangely simple. A path, a dog, a child-sized life stolen into the storm, and his own body answering the need in front of it. Nothing behind him could command this moment unless he let it. So he did the one thing grief hates most. He stopped looking backward. The trail cut toward the old timber road, where the ground dropped sharply, and rainwater rushed through the ruts like narrow streams. The land there was dangerous, even in decent weather. Half-rotted planks at the edge of the slope, old posts jutting from the ground, ditches deep enough to break a leg if a man stepped blind. Tonight, under the storm, it felt like the whole hillside had turned fluid. Ezra's voice crackled faintly behind somewhere through the radio static, relaying directions. Nolan had gotten one deputy unit moving from the highway side, another from the county maintenance shed. None of it would matter if they were minutes too late. Silas reached the road just in time to see motion ahead. A man. He was half-shadowed by rain and distance, but broad enough through the shoulders, moving badly in the mud while trying to hold something tucked under a canvas jacket. Wren gave a thin, weak cry that cut through the storm like a wire pulled too tight. "There!" Ezra shouted from farther back. The man turned. He ran for the deeper ditch line near the slope. Bramble lunged after him. The man swung once with his free arm, not a weapon, just a desperate strike to keep the dog off. Bramble twisted away, slipped, recovered, and came back lower, faster, smarter. She was not fighting to maul. She was driving him off balance, forcing him toward the narrow strip between the road and the runoff channel. And that was when Silas heard another voice. "Bramble! Edith!" He turned in disbelief. Halfway up the road behind them, under Marlene's arm and slipping even as she tried to hurry, came Edith in Silas's oversized flannel and a borrowed raincoat she had not managed to button all the way. Her silver hair had come loose in the wind. Her face was white with strain. Marlene, shorter and heavier, but stubborn as old oak, was trying to hold her back and failing because fear had made Edith lighter than sense. "Go back!" Silas roared. Edith did not. She looked past him, past everything, to the shape in the man's arms and the dog racing through the rain. The kidnapper reached the edge of the ditch and stumbled. Wren slipped from inside the jacket, landing not in the water but on the slick mud a few feet from the drop, small body writhing weakly. Everything happened at once after that. The man lunged for the puppy. Bramble closed in from the left. Edith took one step too many toward the edge of the road. The mud under her boots sheared away. Marlene screamed and caught only Edith's sleeve as the old woman pitched sideways toward the runoff channel, where rainwater foamed brown around broken posts and shattered planks. Silas ran. Time did not slow, not really. That was the lie people told later, because their minds could not accept how many decisions had fit into 1 second. What actually happened was faster and crueler than that. Wren lay on the mud within reach of the man. Edith slid toward the water. Bramble saw both. The dog's body changed direction mid-stride with a violence that looked almost impossible on an injured paw. She flung herself not toward her puppy, but across Edith's falling path, slamming shoulder first into the old woman's side. It was not a thoughtful sacrifice in any human sense. It was instinct made holy by loyalty. Protect the life collapsing nearest. Protect the one who had fed, waited, spoken gently, returned. That impact slowed Edith just enough. Silas dove and caught her under the arms before the runoff could take her. Nolan arrived from the opposite side at nearly the same moment, hitting the man at the knees and driving him face first into the mud. Wren rolled free. Ezra snatched the puppy up and tucked her inside his jacket. The man thrashed once, twice, then lost the fight to Nolan's weight and the cuffs that followed. Bramble paid for her choice. The force of her turn sent her skidding broadside into one of the old timber posts at the road edge. Her back struck wood with a dull, ugly sound. She dropped hard, scrambled up, and nearly fell again. "Bramble!" Edith cried, sobbing now with no strength left to hide it. Silas eased Edith back toward Marlene and June, who had reached them seconds later, then dropped to one knee beside the dog. Bramble's sides heaved. Rain ran off her muzzle in trembling streams. Mud streaked her coat. One hind leg shook when she tried to bear weight. But when Ezra held up the bundle inside his jacket, Wren gave a thin, furious squeak. Bramble lifted her head at once. Alive. That was all she needed to know. Sirens rose in the distance, faint at first and then nearer through the rain. County units, an ambulance, help, finally, in the blunt, practical form it always took when the worst was already almost over. Nolan dragged the captive man up by the arm and shoved him toward the road shoulder. In the wash of headlights from the first arriving unit, his face came clear for the first time. Mid-30s, unshaven, rain-slick hair, plastered to a narrow skull, eyes mean in the quick evasive way of cowards who mistake secrecy for intelligence. Silas did not know him by name, but the sight of him brought no satisfaction. Only anger sharpened into focus. June crouched beside Edith in the mud, checking her pulse with cold fingers and a voice calm enough to lie kindly. "You're with me, Edith. Stay with me." Marlene knelt in the rain too, one hand on Edith's shoulder, muttering through tears and irritation the way women of her generation often disguised love when it became too large to manage cleanly. "You impossible old fool! You impossible, impossible fool!" Edith's gaze searched past all of them until it found Bramble. The ambulance crew reached them with a stretcher. Nolan took over the scene with clipped authority, directing one deputy to the prisoner, another to the road, Ezra to hand over Wren only long enough for June to check the pup before tucking her back near the mother. Silas stayed where he was, one hand steady against Bramble's side as the dog's breathing slowly eased from panic to pain. This time, he thought, and the words came without drama, only certainty. I was not too late. He had not outrun the past. He had simply refused to let it take command. When the paramedics lifted Edith, she caught at his sleeve. Her hand was weak but determined. Silas bent close, rain running off his hair and jaw. Her words came broken by breath and weather, so soft he nearly missed them. "She didn't come to your door by accident," Edith whispered. "She'd been sitting outside your porch for weeks." Silas stared at her. Around them, red and blue emergency lights strobed against the rain. Wren was alive. Bramble was hurt but breathing. Nolan was hauling answers out of chaos, one order at a time. And in the middle of all of it, Silas felt something colder than shock move through him. Bramble had chosen him before the night she scratched at his door. The storm swallowed the rest of Edith's breath, but not the meaning of it. The storm left the world cleaner than it had found it. 2 mornings later, the sky over northern Maine rose clear and pale, washed in the kind of thin gold light that only appeared after rain had spent all its fury and moved on. The pine trees around Silas Boone's cabin stood dark and rinsed, each needle catching brightness along its edge. The lake beyond the forest showed itself again in pieces through the trunks, flat and silver like hammered metal. The road, still rutted and ugly with drying mud, no longer looked like a threat. It looked like something survivable. That, Silas thought, was as much as anyone could ask of a place. He stood on the porch with a hammer in one hand and a replacement board balanced against the rail. The storm had loosened part of the eave overhang, and he had told himself that repairing it was simply practical. But the truth was simpler and less flattering. Working with wood gave a man something solid to answer when his mind tried to wander toward the shape of what had almost happened. Below him, in the yard, Wren wobbled through the damp grass on oversized paws, pausing every few steps to investigate leaves with fierce seriousness. The little German shepherd was still small for her age, still a bit narrow through the ribs, but her movements had gained strength. Her black and tan coat was beginning to thicken, and her ears had started their uncertain journey upward, one trying very hard to stand, while the other still leaned sideways in comic betrayal. Every few moments she would stumble, right herself, and continue as if dignity were a problem for older creatures. On the top porch step, Bramble lay sphinx still. She had recovered enough that the worst of the weakness was gone, though the injury from striking the timber post had left a temporary stiffness along her back and right side. Her coat had regained its depth, dark saddle across the spine, rich tan at the legs and chest, muzzle lean and intelligent, amber brown eyes always half watchful, even when her body looked at rest. She still did not waste movement. She still distrusted unfamiliar engines. But she no longer startled every time Silas crossed a room. That was new, that mattered, and perhaps most telling of all, she had chosen the porch. Not the woods, not the shadow behind the shed, not the far edge of the yard, where escape would be easiest. The porch, where she could watch the road, the puppy, and the front door all at once. Silas drove in another nail, then rested the hammer on his thigh. The cabin no longer sounded like the empty place it had been before the first storm. There were too many small signs of life now. The scrape of a food bowl inside the mudroom, the soft clink of a kettle, a blanket still hanging over the back of the chair June favored whenever she stopped by, tire tracks that belonged to visitors and not intruders. He had not meant for any of that to happen. But then, very little that mattered had ever arrived in his life by asking permission first. Behind him, the screen door opened. Edith Vale stepped carefully onto the porch, one hand on the frame, the other holding a cane she hated using and had therefore decorated with a strip of blue ribbon, as if mockery softened necessity. She wore a long gray cardigan under a weatherproof coat too large for her, and the wind teased silver strands loose from the careful knot at the back of her head. She looked thinner than she had before the second storm, as though the danger had taken something from her even while sparing her life. But her face was brighter in one important way. The strain around her mouth had eased. It was not health. It was relief. "You're doing that wrong," she said. Silas glanced back. "Good morning to you, too. You're leaning the board before you've checked the nail line." "I checked it." Edith came 2 steps farther and studied the repair with the authority of someone who had once been married to a man who fixed everything twice, once badly and once correctly. "You checked it with confidence. That isn't always the same thing." From the yard, Wren gave a tiny bark at a leaf she had apparently decided was morally suspicious. Bramble lifted her head, watched the puppy for 1 second, then lowered it again. Silas smiled before he could stop himself. Edith saw it and did not comment. That was one of the kinder things older people sometimes did. Let a person keep his dignity by pretending not to witness the exact moment it softened. From the drive came the sound of another vehicle. Bramble's ears rose, but she did not stand. Nolan Price got out first, tall and broad in plain clothes this time, dark jacket, jeans, boots muddy at the edges. Without the deputy's uniform, he looked less official and more like what he truly was beneath it. A local man carrying too many responsibilities and not enough patience. His face still had that same cut-stone seriousness, but grief and long duty lived in it now too, if one looked long enough. He came up the walk holding a paper cup of coffee and a folder gone soft at the corners from use. Behind him came June Mercer in her field jacket, and Ezra Quinn, who waved at Wren with the delighted restraint of a man trying not to spook a puppy, and failing because joy made him obvious. "We brought updates," Nolan said. "That sounds expensive," Silas replied. "It probably will be." They gathered inside around the table, while Marlene Pike, who had arrived 10 minutes earlier with muffins and unsolicited opinions, settled Edith in the best chair, as if she owned the place. Marlene had resumed her usual appearance of being pleasantly scandalized by everyone's life choices. Her full cheeks had gone pink from the drive, and her plum scarf looked like it had been tied in irritation. She kept one eye on Edith and one on Wren, which was probably the same thing in different forms. Nolan opened the folder. "The man we picked up finally talked after he understood how much trouble he was already in," he said. "Not some giant trafficking ring. Nothing dramatic enough for television. Just a filthy little chain of men using abandoned parcels and private sheds to hold dogs off the books. Breeding, selling, trading. Sometimes keeping the good ones confined until they could move them someplace else. Small enough to hide. Mean enough to do damage." Edith lowered her eyes. Nolan continued. "The old timber parcel was one location. We found 2 more. Not far. Some records, a few veterinary supplies, restraints, feed. Enough to confirm what we thought." He looked toward Bramble. "And enough dogs still there that June and the county animal people spent yesterday knee-deep in mud earning their pay." Ezra's face brightened despite the grimness of the subject. 7 in total," he said. "Scared out of their minds, but alive." June nodded. 3 need serious rehab. 2 are older than they should be for the condition they were kept in, but they're out." Silas sat back slightly. That mattered more than he could say. Harvey Lynn's truck rattled up the drive before anyone had time to settle fully into the good news, and the old mechanic came in with his cap in hand and a look on his face that was rarer for him than snow in July. Uncertainty. Harvey was still built like an old workbench, square, worn, dependable, and still smelled faintly of oil no matter how clean his shirt was. He stood in the doorway, saw Bramble on the porch through the open screen, and then looked at Silas. "I should have said this sooner," he admitted. "Didn't think it mattered at the time." Nolan sighed. "That sentence should be illegal in this county." Harvey ignored him. "Past few weeks before the first storm, I'd head to the garage before sunup some mornings. Saw that shepherd more than once at the lower bend by your place." He pointed toward Silas with 2 thick fingers. "Not passing through. Sitting, watching your cabin, then disappearing when daylight came." The room went quiet around that. Silas did not move. Harvey shifted his weight. "I figured she was just one more stray taking measure of a warm porch, but she kept coming back. Same spot, same hour, like she was deciding something." No one spoke for a beat too long. Bramble, as if feeling the change in the air without knowing the words, rose and came to the doorway. She looked from Harvey to Silas and then, oddly, to Edith. Edith's eyes filled before she smiled. "There," she said softly. "You see? I told you she knew." Later, after Nolan and June had gone back to work, and Ezra had promised to return with proper fencing materials for a safer puppy run, the cabin settled into the slower rhythm of ordinary afternoon. Rainwater still dripped now and then from the eaves, but the sky had fully cleared. Sun moved through the pines in long, warm ba. Wren slept in a patch of light on the floor, belly round from feeding. Bramble remained near the door, but her body had loosened. Not safe, never that. But less ready to flee the second the world shifted. Edith sat by the window with a mug in both hands. Marlene had finally left after issuing enough instructions to keep 3 households alive through winter. Silas was repairing the porch rail again when Edith spoke. "Every time I left food for her," she said, "I talked." He glanced over his shoulder. "To the dog?" Edith gave him a dry look. "Mostly. Sometimes to myself. At my age, the distinction becomes mercifully unimportant." Silas came inside and leaned against the doorframe. "I told her all kinds of things. Foolish things. About weather, about growing old, about how the town changes but the roads don't, about my Micah." Her fingers tightened around the mug. and sometimes about a man at the end of the logging road. He did not answer. You had a reputation once, Edith said. Around here, I mean, before you got quieter, before people learned to stop knocking unless the need was serious. She looked out the window at Bramble. I told her there was a man in these woods who knew how to act when something mattered. A man who had forgotten himself, some perhaps, but not all the way. Silas let out a breath that was not quite a laugh. You told a half-wild dog that? I told a listening creature where safety lived. He had no response ready for that. Edith turned to him then, and her face, lined, weary, very nearly transparent in the afternoon light, held no fantasy in it, no mystical nonsense, only an old woman's practical faith in how living things make associations. She didn't understand the words, Edith said, but she understood my voice when I spoke of this place. She understood trust. She understood that when I said your cabin, I meant somewhere my fear eased. A pause. That is enough for many creatures, more than enough. Outside, Wren awoke and stumbled toward Bramble, bumping clumsily into one long foreleg. Bramble lowered her head and nosed the puppy upright with astonishing gentleness for a dog who had survived by hard instinct. Silas watched them. All at once, the answer ceased to feel mystical and became almost painfully simple. Bramble had not found him by miracle. She had found him by watching, by listening, by returning over and over to the same place until a pattern settled in her. She had chosen him not because he was the strongest man within miles, but because her one human reference point for safety had attached his cabin to calm. The realization hit him harder than heroism would have. He had not been selected for glory. He had been selected because something wounded had believed his door might still open. That night, after Edith had gone home with Marlene and Nolan, had called once more to say another 2 dogs had been transferred safely out of county holding, Silas sat on the porch steps while the evening cooled around the trees. Bramble lay behind him in the doorway. Wren, exhausted from existing, slept inside in a folded blanket near the stove. The sky turned lavender over the pines. Insects started up their thin summer chorus. Somewhere down the road, a screen door banged and laughter carried from a neighboring property. The world had resumed its ordinary life without asking whether he was ready for it. For years, Silas had told himself solitude was discipline. That distance was the same as peace. That if he reduced his life to wood smoke, routine, and silence, he could outlast the ache of what he had failed to save before. But the cabin no longer belonged to Silence. There were bowls by the door now, a folded veterinary chart June had left on the fridge, Ezra's promised fencing materials stacked under the porch, Marlene's muffins on the counter, Nolan's coffee cup in the sink because he had forgotten it in the morning, and Silas suspected he would forget others. There was the possibility of footsteps on the gravel that did not mean trouble. There was a dog on his threshold not leaving. There was a puppy dreaming by the stove. He was not healed. That would have been too neat, and life had never been neat enough to deserve that word. But the pain no longer ruled the whole map. Over the next week, Bramble stayed longer each day. At first, she slept on the porch and vanished into the yard at dusk, only to reappear before dawn. Then, one morning, she was still there when Silas opened the door. The next, she followed him to the shed and back. By the end of the week, she had stopped standing at the tree line as if measuring the distance to escape. No papers were signed, no speeches made, no one declared ownership. She simply remained, and that was somehow better. One late afternoon, after another light shower had passed through and left the porch board shining, Silas climbed the ladder again to finish repairing the eave for good. Sun slanted through the trees in long, amber stripes. Wren chased a damp leaf across the yard with more conviction than coordination. Bramble rested on the threshold, eyes half closed, ears still attending to every sound from the road. From the bend below, Edith's old sedan appeared at a cautious pace, followed by Marlene's truck just behind it, close enough to be a promise. Harvey had repaired the car enough to keep it moving, though not gracefully. It rattled up the drive and stopped. No one rushed. Edith sat behind the wheel a moment before getting out, thinner than before, slower than before, but smiling in a way Silas had not yet seen from her. Marlene climbed out too, already carrying a paper sack of something she claimed was not for the dog, and was therefore almost certainly for the dog. Silas climbed down from the ladder. Wren barreled toward the newcomers and fell over her own feet halfway there. Bramble lifted her head, watched Edith step from the car, and then, with quiet certainty, rose to meet her at the edge of the porch. Silas stood in the slanting light, hammer still in one hand, and understood at last that some storms did not come to take. They came to knock. Not on wood, not on windows. On the last shut door inside a man who had forgotten that opening it was still possible. Sometimes miracles do not arrive with thunder. Sometimes they come soaked in rain, trembling at a locked door, asking one wounded heart to open for another. In this story, the rescue was never only about a frightened mother dog, a fragile puppy, or an elderly woman caught between weakness and courage. It was about something deeper. The quiet way God can guide broken lives toward one another at exactly the moment they are needed most. Bramble did not choose the strongest house. She chose the right one. And perhaps that is how grace often works in our own lives. Not always through power, not always through certainty, but through love, trust, and the small acts of mercy that seem ordinary, until we realize they changed everything. Silas thought his best years were behind him. Edith thought her strength was too small to matter. Bramble had every reason to stop trusting the world, yet God used each of them anyway. He used an old woman's kindness, a dog's loyalty, and a tired man's buried goodness to protect life, restore hope, and bring light back into a home that had grown too silent. That is a lesson for all of us. In daily life, many people feel like Silas, tired, closed off, carrying pain they do not talk about. Many feel like Edith, wondering whether their small acts of care make any difference at all. And many feel like Bramble, moving through the world wounded, cautious, and unsure where safety can still be found. But this story reminds us that God sees every hidden burden, every quiet kindness, and every door we struggle to open. He is still working through compassion. He is still bringing the right people together. He is still turning storms into turning points. Sometimes the miracle is not that our pain disappears. Sometimes the miracle is that God uses that pain to make us more gentle, more awake, and more willing to answer when someone else is in need. So if this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who may need encouragement today. Leave a comment and tell us what moment stayed with you the most and where you are watching from. And if you believe that God still works through ordinary lives and unexpected moments, subscribe to the channel so you do not miss more stories of faith, healing, and the bond between people and animals. May God bless every person watching. May He protect your home, strengthen your heart, comfort you in your difficult days, and send help to your door when you need it most. And may He remind you that even in the darkest storm, you are never forgotten.